Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fruits and flabbergasters, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for the traits, food and skill changes only. Today's class of choice is the Thief and the elite specialization is the Daredevil. This time I got two builds for you, a Condi DPS build and an open world roaming build. And the build links are as always in the description of the video. But before we dive into the build, let's talk some pros and cons. The build has great damage, which is further amplified when you have allies around. Condi Daredevil also comes with great survivability through its constant evades. And on top of its native kit, it also has access to stolen skills which often provide good damage and support. Daredevil natively is a quite squishy specialization, so it's important that you try to avoid as many hits as you can. The build also involves quite a bit of forced movement in melee range, which can be a risky little game. Alright, let's dive into the build. In order to summarize Condi Daredevil, I have prepared a little presentation. Condi Daredevil is all about evading attacks and stabbing stuff in between. Daredevil changes the dodge mechanic from Thief based on the Grandmaster trait choice you make. For Condi, Daredevil will always go with Lotus training. This makes your dodge ability fire daggers at enemies that apply conditions. Your dodge also becomes a well finisher this way. After dodging, you'll gain 15% increased damage for 4 seconds. This buff is rather short, but you can keep this up quite easily. As usual, dodging goes backwards by default, but you can control the direction of it by pressing movement skills. This will become important in the rotation later. Like core Thief, Daredevil does not have individual cooldowns on its weapon skills. You can freely use them as often as you like, as long as your initiative level allows you to. Initiative can be found above your weapon skills and you gain 1 initiative per second. Only weapon skills cost initiative, not utilities. Again, like core Thief, you can use the steal skill. This is instant, so you can use it at all times and it teleports you to your target. Upon usage, it grants you a stolen skill that depends on the type of enemy that you face. These stolen skills are pretty useful since they provide a set of different effects: CC, high damage, stealth, healing, conditions, combo fields, etc. Look at the wiki page for stolen skills if you need more detailed info on all of their effects. Especially the stolen skills from strike missions and raids are very strong. In this build we'll be using dual daggers with a pistol on the main hand on the other weapon bar. You can also use a short bow, but more on that later. Let's begin with dual daggers. The dagger auto attack chain is very fast paced and applies bleeding and poison in the process. Compared to your other skills, the auto attack chain does comparably low damage, so you can always prioritize other skills over it. You should still try to finish the chains whenever you can, but it's not a big deal if you don't. Dagger 2, 4 and 5 aren't really used in the build. You can use Dagger 2 to cover some ground and Dagger 4 to apply ranged torment, but that's about it. When in doubt, it's always better to spend initiative for Dagger 3 if you can, Death Blossom. This skill is really strong, it's an evade and applies poison and 30-second bleeding. Like your dodge, this also becomes a well finisher. The bleeding stacks from this attack, since they last so long, will slowly accumulate over time. There's one important detail here though. This skill will always launch you over your target, starting from wherever you stand. Unlike dodging, you cannot directly control the direction of movement on this, so make sure to always stand relative to your target so that this does not cause issues. As a secondary weapon, particularly for harder open world content, we're gonna add a main hand pistol. Pistol gives you access to ranged abilities, which can make soloing hero points and bounties much easier. You can also swap to pistol in cases where you cannot be in melee range in group content. The pistol auto attack is very basic and applies bleeding on hit. Pistol 2 is Bowler Shot. This is actually nice for damage when you can't be in melee range since it immobilizes enemies. In this build, whenever you immobilize enemies, you also apply 2 stacks of poison to them due to the trait Panic Strike. You'll see that Condi Daredevil has a lot of immobilizers in its kit, so this becomes a pretty important trait. The dual attack with pistol and dagger changes to Shadow Strike. This is a teleport ability that ports you backwards, but only if you hit with a melee stab. It also applies Torment. This is a very nice ability to bait enemies into using melee abilities and then porting out of reach. After using Shadow Strike, you gain access to Repeater, a ranged pistol ability that applies decent amounts of bleeding. Nothing in comparison to Death Blossom, but still good enough to use it. All the ranged pistol skills are also projectile finishers, so you can make use of combo fields with these too. Finally, the last weapon you can try out is the shortbow. This gives you access to additional mobility from shortbow 5 Infiltrator's Arrow. Shortbow 2 and 4 apply bleeding and poison respectively, and Shortbow 4 is also a poison combo field and dazes. I personally prefer pistol, but Shortbow is a very good weapon to use on the secondary bar too. Alright, let's talk utility skills. The healing skill I mostly use is Signet of Malice. This heals you for every attack you perform. Condi Daredevil has a lot of attacks per second, especially on dual daggers. This heals you for quite substantial amounts. Paired with all your evades, you can heal back up pretty quickly even if you get hit in between. Since both your dodge and Death Blossom hit multiple targets, this scales up with the number of enemies that you hit with them. An alternative for group content can be Skelk Venom. This can be nice in groups to provide healing for your subgroup since it heals 5 targets on the next attacks. The next slot is usually occupied by Thousand Needles. Thousand Needles is a strong AoE tool that applies a lot of poison and bleeding and an immobilize on the first hit of the AoE. This has 2 casts, one preparation and then another cast to activate. Between those you have 3-second ramp up time. The second cast does not have a cast time, so you can use it while doing other things. This skill requires some anticipation of enemy movement. Against enemies that move too much and in open world roaming, you can also change this to impairing daggers. That is a ranged skill that, surprise, applies Immobilize and a lot of poison. After that we're using both Devourer Venom and Spider Venom. These are very strong when you have allies around you because venoms are shared with up to 5 targets so that they apply the venom effect. The conditions they apply count for your damage, which is why the damage of Condi Daredevil is increased drastically when you're not alone. In solo applications, venoms are actually not that powerful because they only apply a fraction of the stacks. If you don't want to swap around all the time, it's surely fine to use them everywhere though. Alternatives for these for solo gameplay would be Caltrops and Haste. Caltrops provides a long-lasting AoE that applies bleeding and triggers melee Signet on every hit, while Haste gives you a stun break with quickness, fury and might on it. You shouldn't really get hit to make use of this, but it can't hurt to have another safety net in the beginning. The lead skill depends on what you need. For CC, you should run Basilisk Venom in group content. It's one of the strongest CC skills in the game with allies around, as it works just like the other Venom skills and multiplies the CC potential by 5 in groups. For damage you can run Thieves Guild. It's not a large DPS gain, but noticeable enough. Finally, for open world, Dagger Storm can be nice for a 3-second evade that heals you for a lot in the process, especially against several enemies. It applies bleeding and each projectile from this is a world finisher too. Alright, let's move on to gear. For Condi Daredevil, we'll default to full Viper with Crate runes. If you want cheaper runes, you can also go for Afflicted runes, which are very close in terms of DPS. The sigils on the weapons are Torment and Earth. If you want, you can also put a Doom sigil on instead of the Torment sigil and weapon swap on cooldown instead for a small DPS gain. It can cause more issues than it solves if you don't weapon swap enough though, so it's not really needed. As for consumables, we'll go with the Kimchi Tofu Stew food. This gives you 100% duration on both poison and bleeding, the 2 main conditions for damage. If you run Afflicted runes, make sure to swap to the Kimchi Pancake food when you do this. This is done to get close to the cap on bleeding duration. Since Afflicted runes have higher native Condi duration, they benefit more from conditions applied by all the world finishes in the kit. The default utility item is the Toxic Focusing Crystal. A cheap alternative is the Tuning Icicle. If you can afford it, you can also run a Writ of Masterful Malice for a small boost to condition damage. Next up we got specialization and traits. We'll be using the same specializations everywhere, which is very convenient. Deadly Arts, Trickery and of course Daredevil. As always, I won't explain every trait in detail, but rather go through the traits that affect the playstyle. Let's begin with Deadly Arts. The main focus of the trait choices here lies on empowering and applying poison. Increases your duration of it, applies it whenever one applies Immobilize, when using Steel and when you use a dual attack. The latter triggers on both Shadow Strike and Death Blossom, but not when using Shortbow 3. You will further gain increased condition damage and strike damage per condition on the target. The strike damage is rather negligible since the share of power damage on Condi Daredevil is very small. Using Deadly Arts also contributes to weakness uptime, which is a nice side effect as we'll see later when we go through Daredevil. Next up we have Trickery. Aside from overall condition duration and vigor uptime on using Steel, this mainly improves the damage done with bleeding. You'll leave behind Caltrops whenever you dodge and apply bleeding on Steel. An important trait for overall damage is lead attacks. This gives you a damage buff for each point of initiative spent. For that reason, you want to use as much initiative as possible by spamming Death Blossom, paired with dodge. Trickery further increases your maximum initiative to 15 and gives you initiative back when using Steel. Both Deadly Arts and Trickery are essential and should not be changed. You can choose between Uncatchable and Thrill of the Crime in open world if you want to provide some boosts for yourself, like Fury, Might and Swiftness. Last but not least, let's talk about Daredevil itself. I already explained the changes to dodge from Lotus Training in the beginning, so we'll skip that one. Most of the traits are actually a little gimmicky since they mostly boost strike damage. A choice you can make for both group content and open world is between Marauder's Resilience and Escape's Fortitude. Marauder's Resilience gives you a good chunk of health and lower damage taken from melee combat, while Escape's Fortitude transcends conditions and heals you for around 450 health whenever you evade an attack. And remember, you have a lot of evades. Both have their uses depending on the fight that you're in, so just try to see what you like better. Condi Daredevil is able to maintain weakened very well and benefits from it in two ways. You deal more strike damage to weakened foes and take less damage from them. The strike damage is not really noticeable on Condi Daredevil, but the damage taken is. Your dual attacks apply 6 seconds of weakness, and the next attack after dodging does so too. This way you can reduce incoming damage quite a bit. Finally, Daredevil makes stealing give you 1 dodge back. Paired with the initiative gain on steal from trickery, you can usually do another Death Blossom and dodge combo after stealing. Since we'll be using mostly the same trait choices, you might wonder, how do I adjust for survivability in open world? Because as always, it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that you can sustain on your own. On Daredevil, this consists of maximizing the number of dodges you have available. You should aim to avoid basically all incoming attacks on Daredevil, which can be done with the right gear setup. As usual, we'll follow a particular priority list for survivability changes. Gear is expensive unless you have legendary gear, so we'll adjust food and traits first. In terms of food, you can swap to the bowl of Orient truffle and meat stew. This increases your endurance recovery by 40%, which leads to 90% when paired with vigor. You can put on a venom sigil to make up for the poison duration loss from this, but it's usually not needed. In terms of traits, there are not many adjustments you can make without sacrificing substantial amounts of damage. I mentioned the choice between Marauder's Resilience and Escape's Fortitude earlier. This can make a whole lot of difference depending on whether you have lots of conditions applied to you or not. Your best bet is to use pistol on fights where you are uncertain about being in melee and kite enemies. When they do get close and potentially hit you, use Shadow Strike to teleport away and then Repeater to deal damage from range. Save Dagger Storm for iffy situations since it heals you for every projectile and is a long evade that allows you to move away from danger. The last step would be to change gear. Since Condi Daredevil has a small share of power damage, you can change a few pieces to Ritualist or Trailblazer gear. Ritualist armor in rare is very cheap and you can buy Trailblazer glitched adventure weapons for relatively cheap on the TP. Always try the other options first though. In the final section of the video, I want to provide some guidance on the Daredevil rotation. Condi Daredevil has a very simple rotation concept. As I said in the beginning, it involves constant forced movement that may take you a little bit of time to get used to, but it's a lot of fun once you do. The benchmark rotation dodges forward and then uses Death Blossom to move backwards again. I found that to be a little unintuitive since it requires you to press forward for dodging. I swapped the order of the two compared to the benchmark so that you use Death Blossom to move forward and then use dodge to move backwards again. This does not require you to press any movement keys, you can do it either way though. For the opener, what we'll do is we're starting by preparing 1000 Needles. The cooldown of this starts after using the first cast, allowing you to prepare this beforehand to use it twice pretty much immediately. These days, Venoms are removed when entering combat, so you cannot precast them, so that you have to wait until combat starts to actually use them. They're instant cast though, so use them as soon as you can in combat. Then spam Dodge and Death Blossom until you have no initiative and no endurance left. After that, the combination is always the same. Use Death Blossom to move forward, dodge backwards. If you use the Doom Sigil, make sure to weapon swap towards the end of your dodge. That way you don't lose any time in the rotation. Make sure to dodge at least every 4 seconds to maintain the 15% Condi damage buff from Lotus Training and spend your initiative to keep the lead attacks buff up with at least 12 stacks. Use Venoms, 1000 Needles and Steal on cooldown and fill the gaps with auto attacks. Try to finish auto attack chains, but it's not that big of a deal if you don't, as I said. Save Basilisk Venom for CC whenever you need it. Before I conclude, I want to mention some specific stolen skills, which you obtain in strike missions and raids. On some encounters like Slaughtersaw, you'll receive Stone Soul Venom. This cleanses lots of conditions off of allies and yourself, which can be very helpful on those fights. In strike missions, you also sometimes obtain a cursed artifact. This applies a ton of conditions including vulnerability, is an ethereal combo field you can use to apply confusion, and is always worth casting. On quite a few other bosses like Mursad Overseer, you steal Detonate Plasma. This grants all boons to your subgroup, which is really strong. There's also an overworld variant of this that applies boons only to yourself, Consume Plasma. If you want to know more stolen skills from various enemies, the wiki has a detailed search tool for stolen skills, so check that out. That's it. In my opinion, Condi Daredevil is lots of fun in both open world and group content and provides nice utility with stolen skills. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try out Condition Daredevil. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy stealing!